Hello, and welcome to another episode of EC&M Asks, a Q&A video series in our members-only section in which readers pose their most pressing electrical questions and our subject matter experts answer. I'm Tommy Northcott, Senior Power Engineer and Branch Manager with Jacobs. Today, I'm going to answer a couple of questions I get asked frequently about thermography or infrared inspections. So let's jump right in. I've frequently been asked if arc flash PPE is required for performing infrared inspections on electrical equipment. And my short answer is, it depends. So let's unpack this a little bit. First, let's just point out a few things about infrared scans. I believe infrared scans are a very useful tool in a predictive maintenance program, and I encourage their use. I encourage anything that is predictive in nature when it comes to maintenance. It is always good to evaluate the health of equipment as a driver for what corrective actions should be taken rather than depending solely on frequency-based tasks. So infrared scanning is a very useful tool to have in your toolbox. And I will say up front that they can be performed very safely. But there are a few things to keep in mind related to infrared scanning. First, contrary to what movies will imply, you cannot get infrared scans through objects. To get a useful image of a bus connection or a circuit part, you have to have an unobstructed view, either through open air or an infrared window. Next, the most useful infrared data is only available when the circuit part is under a heavy load, which means there's a lot of electrical energy available. That high energy also often translates into a potential arc flash hazard. So with that in mind, let's talk about the procedure. Traditionally, in order to perform an infrared scan, we would need to remove enclosure covers so that the conductors and components to be scanned are exposed. However, people in facilities don't like to lose their power. So often this means that the covers are removed with the equipment energized. I'll say first that I do not recommend this at all. However, if this is your procedure, then I absolutely say that arc flash PPE is required for equipment that poses an arc flash hazard while you're removing the enclosure covers. Then you would need to know the arc flash boundary distance and the restricted approach boundary distance, and step outside of those boundaries to perform the scan from a safe distance without the need to wear PPE. However, the better approach would be to put the equipment in an electrically safe work condition and then remove the covers. Then you could re-energize the equipment, get it to a heavily loaded condition, and perform the scan outside of the shock and arc flash boundaries. Then you just reverse the process to safely put it back into service. With that being said, in this scenario, my recommendation would be that while the equipment is in an electrically safe work condition, install infrared windows in the enclosure covers that provide visibility to the pertinent conductors and components so that the next time the scan can be done with all the enclosure covers in place so there's no exposed circuits or circuit parts, meaning that there's no arc flash or electric shock hazard. It's easy to build a return on investment case for installing these infrared windows. The cost of the labor hours of repeatedly removing and installing the enclosures will quickly outweigh the cost of installing the windows once so that all future infrared scans can be done without that labor cost or the safety hazard of removing those enclosures. So the answer to the question of whether or not arc flash PPE is needed really comes down to the procedure being performed. If you're scanning through infrared windows, then arc flash PPE probably isn't needed. If there are no infrared windows and the equipment has an arc flash potential, then most likely at least part of the task will require arc flash PPE. But keep in mind that prior to any electrical task, we are required to perform an arc flash hazard risk assessment and an electric shock risk assessment. Those assessments will determine if arc flash PPE is needed to perform that specific task. Another question I've been asked a few times is if an energized electrical work permit or an EEWP is needed to perform infrared scans. The simple answer is that as long as the task does not require the worker to cross the restricted approach boundary, then the NFPA 70E does not require the EEWP for that task. However, there is a chance that there may be some subtasks involved that might drive the need for an EEWP. And again, an arc flash and electric shock hazard risk assessment will need to be performed, and the outcome of those assessments should determine if an EEWP is needed. There are so many variables involved in electrical work, it's difficult to say dogmatically what a generic task will require. That is why the risk assessments need to be performed to evaluate all the variables associated with that specific task to determine all the required PPE and documentation. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode. Thank you for watching. Be sure to check back in the members only section for new EC&M Asks videos being posted regularly. Be sure to send me your questions and I'd be happy to do my best to answer them. Have a blessed day.